It was the first week of the new school term, and Lincoln High's hallways buzzed with that mixture of excitement and dread that came with unfamiliar faces and new classes. But for Mia Alvarez, the shy, soft-spoken girl who always kept her head down, it was just another stretch of survival. She was the type who walked with her books clutched tight to her chest, who sat at the back of the class near the window, who scribbled sketches of flowers and stars in the corners of her notebook while praying no one would notice her, because when people noticed her, it usually didn't end well, and no one embodied that truth more than Jason Clark, the school's self-proclaimed king of intimidation, whose tall frame, varsity jacket, and cocky grin made teachers wary and most students silent in his presence. He had a reputation for shoving kids into lockers for sport, flipping lunch trays just to see food scatter, and whispering insults that clung to people long after they walked away. But that morning, for reasons Mia couldn't guess, his attention locked on her the second she stepped into the cafeteria, and she felt it, the prickle down her spine, the unspoken warning that today might not pass quietly. She tried to sit at her usual table in the far corner, but before she could even take a bite of her sandwich, Jason's shadow loomed over her, his voice dripping mockery as he said, well, if it isn't Little Miss Mouse. You planning on squeaking through another year, or do you have an actual voice? And the laughter of his friends echoed like a cruel soundtrack, but Mia, as always, kept her gaze low, muttering something soft, hoping he'd get bored and leave. Instead, he reached down, snatched her notebook, and flipped it open, his smirk widening as he held up her drawings for everyone to see, mocking the delicate pencil lines as if they were a joke. But when she reached for it, whispering "Give it back," he yanked it away and, without warning, gave her a shove that made her stumble back against the table, the sound of trays clattering around them. For most people, that would have been the end. Take the humiliation, wait for it to pass, but something shifted in Mia's eyes in that moment, something cold and sharp that Jason had never seen before, and if you're watching this right now, you'll want to stick around till the very end because what happened next would leave the entire cafeteria in stunned silence, and it's the kind of moment you'll want to replay, so hit that subscribe button and keep watching, because trust me, you do not want to miss the twist. Jason laughed again, clearly enjoying himself. But Mia straightened slowly, meeting his gaze, and there was a stillness in her face that made his smirk falter just slightly, a strange energy in the air as if the noise of the cafeteria had dimmed, and before he could even process it, Mia's hand shot out, not in a frantic grab, but in a precise, controlled motion that twisted his wrist just enough to make him drop her notebook. His eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, she stepped aside, hooked her foot lightly around his ankle, and in one smooth motion, sent the towering school bully off balance so fast that his tray went flying and he landed flat on his back with a crash that drew gasps from every table nearby. Silence fell, the kind of silence where you could hear the hum of the vending machines in the corner. And Jason scrambled to his feet, red-faced, more from shock than pain, his friends staring in disbelief, because nobody did that to Jason Clark, nobody. But Mia didn't gloat, didn't shout, didn't even raise her voice. She simply picked up her notebook, brushed off the cover, and walked away, leaving Jason frozen in place with 100 pairs of eyes burning into him, and though he'd laugh it off later, claim he slipped, deep down, he knew that something about that girl wasn't what it seemed. And for the rest of the day, he couldn't shake the memory of how effortlessly she'd taken him down, how calm she'd been, like someone who'd been trained for this. What Jason didn't know, and what would change everything in the days to come, was that Mia's uncle, the quiet man who walked her to school each morning, was a retired special forces instructor who had taught her self-defense not as a sport, but as a way of surviving a world that didn't always play fair, and as much as Mia had promised herself she'd never use those skills unless absolutely necessary. Something about Jason's shove had triggered a reflex she couldn't suppress. That night, as Jason sat in his room replaying the scene in his head, his pride gnawed at him, turning into anger, and by morning, he'd made up his mind he wasn't going to let some shy little girl embarrass him in front of the entire school, and what he planned next would push both of them into a confrontation far bigger than either of them could have imagined. The next day, the atmosphere in Lincoln High felt heavier, like the quiet before a storm, and while most students whispered excitedly about how Mia flipped Jason in the cafeteria, Jason himself sat at the back of the class, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed, replaying the humiliation in his head. To him, it wasn't just about falling, it was about losing control in front of everyone, and that thought burned hotter than anything else. At lunch, his friends urged him to let it go, but his pride refused. So when school ended, he followed Mia down the sidewalk toward the quiet street that led to her home, each step filled with a growing sense of determination to remind her who was in charge. He caught up to her outside an old playground, calling out in a mocking tone, "Hey, Mouse, we didn't finish our conversation," and when she turned, her eyes flicked past him to the group of older boys lingering nearby. Jason had brought backup. "What do you want?" she asked softly, her voice calm but her stance subtly shifting, and Jason grinned, convinced her composure was an act, I want you to apologize, in front of everyone, for making me look stupid, he said, stepping closer, and the boys behind him chuckled in anticipation, but Mia didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a slow breath and said, "You embarrassed yourself, Jason." All I did was defend myself, and something in the way she said it, steady, certain, sent a ripple of doubt through him, but he pushed it aside, lunging forward to grab her arm. That was the moment everything changed, because in less than a heartbeat, Mia pivoted, breaking his grip with a fluid twist, her free hand pushing against his chest in a precise strike that made him stumble back into one of his friends. The boys laughed nervously, thinking maybe Jason had slipped again, but their smirks vanished when Mia stepped forward, her voice low but clear. "You think I'm scared of you because I'm quiet? You think shy means weak? You've been picking on people your whole life because it's the only way you feel strong, but you've never actually fought someone who knows what they're doing." Jason froze, the truth in her words stinging more than her strike, and that's when a deep voice called out from across the street, Mia's uncle, dressed in worn jeans and a plain jacket, walking toward them with the steady stride of a man who had nothing to prove but everything under control. Jason recognized him as the man who sometimes dropped Mia off, but there was something in his presence, an unshakable authority, that made even the older boy shift uncomfortably. "Everything okay here?" the uncle asked, and Mia nodded, but before she could speak, one of Jason's friends muttered, "We were just talking," clearly trying to defuse the situation, yet the uncle's eyes had already read the truth. He looked at Jason and said quietly, "You should be careful about who you try to intimidate. Some people know how to fight back in ways you don't expect," and there was no threat in his tone, just fact. Jason bristled, wanting to protest, but something in the man's calm, almost military way of standing made him hesitate, and in that moment, he realized that Mia's skills hadn't come from luck. They'd been taught, honed, prepared for moments exactly like this. "Go home, Jason," the uncle added, and though Jason hated the way it felt to back down, he turned, muttering something to his friends, walking away with his mind swirling in confusion and shame. The days that followed were different. He kept his distance from Mia, but he also found himself watching her, trying to understand how someone so quiet could carry herself with such certainty, and that curiosity gnawed at him until one afternoon, he found himself sitting alone in the gym, scrolling on his phone, when Mia walked in for after-school practice, not cheerleading, not art club, but a self-defense class her uncle ran. For a handful of students, Jason stayed hidden in the bleachers, watching as Mia moved through drills with precision, teaching even bigger students how to escape grabs, block strikes, and stay grounded under pressure. Something shifted in him then, a realization that strength didn't have to be loud or cruel, and that maybe he'd been going about life the wrong way. By the end of the week, he swallowed his pride and approached Mia, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Look, about before. I was wrong," he said, eyes on the floor, and though she didn't smile, she gave a small nod, accepting the apology without rubbing it in. Months later, those who remembered the cafeteria incident would sometimes whisper about how Jason Clark stopped being the school's biggest bully and started helping Coach Grant run drills for the self-defense club. And while no one ever really knew the full conversation that passed between Jason and Mia that day, they all knew one thing: sometimes the quietest people are the ones carrying the strongest lessons, and if you've made it this far into their story, you already know the moral. Never underestimate someone because they seem small, and never assume that silence means weakness. It might just mean they're waiting for the right moment to change everything. And if you want more stories like this, stories that prove how courage can flip the script in seconds, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because the next one will leave you just as stunned as Jason was that day.